Okay, we're going to talk about Carl Jung right now. Jung is known as a psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theorist, and probably of all of the different theories and models that we're studying in this class and that you may study in general, Jungian theory is probably seen by more people as being hard to understand, hard to follow, and confusing than pretty much any of the other theories that we're going to go over. At the same time, if you look at theories which really capture people's fancy, and if someone says, wow, I want to learn more about that, it is really cool. This model also is probably one of the more popular ones for people to just say, that is really, really very interesting. Jung is a fascinating person. The text, Scharf, goes into a little bit of the history of his own life. I've read several books on him, and he had quite an interesting life and had some very interesting life experiences, which really, if you know his theory and you read about his life experiences, you can see how they're shaped. There's an interesting story about at 2 times in his life, he had what he thought were some sort of psychic experience. One time I think he was in a room and there was a table or something, and the table just broke in two, just poof, mysteriously. That's a weird thing to have happen. He saw that as some sort of paranormal event, was how he explained it to himself. Well, when you study Jung's theory, he has a definite interest in things which are kind of bordering on the edge. And he has an interest in the spiritual and the mystical. He was very, very well-read, bright, good student, studious from a young age on, well-read and well-traveled, and did not want a theory which only fit sort of one time and one space. So went around the globe, read widely from around the globe, and looked historically over time. And so some of what drives his theory is his rich appreciation of time and place and of culture and of peoples. So when people read him and they get this kind of mystical, interesting, sort of Eastern philosophy flavor, coupled with something psychoanalytic, it's either, this is really weird, or I don't really understand this, or wow, this is fascinating, I want to learn more. So anyway, the chapter on Scharf is probably one of the clearest chapters I have ever read on people who've written about Jungian analysis. So it should give you a good picture. If you choose to get into his direct writings or people who've written more closely to him, expect that you're going to have a meal which is going to take a while to digest. But most people I know who get into this stuff just love it. So it may be very well worth digesting for those of you who are sort of intrigued and want to learn more. Jung started back working in Europe in the turn of the last century, and worked with some of who are known to be sort of the great names as you read through, psychiatric history books. Blailer, however you pronounce his name, was a colleague of Jung's at one time. And then right around the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s, Jung and Freud began working together and had a very close working relationship. Scharf published as a copy of a kind of funny letter that Freud wrote to Jung, but they really did seem to get along very well, and Freud, I think, had great plans for Jung. Unfortunately, often great thinkers and great people and great writers and people who make a huge difference in the world, usually they're not kind of just laid-back, easygoing people. They tend to be people with much energy and much passion, and that's a good thing, as long as the passion is going in a good direction. Much energy and much passion, if things turn bad, can be very painful, and people can get very, very, very bent out of shape or upset about something that someone who is more easygoing and laid-back might just let slide. In the early part of the first decade of the 1900s, Jung and Freud kind of came to a parting of the ways, mostly based on ideology. Jung kind of took issue with Freud seeing sexual energy as undergirding or underlying everything, and really just didn't think that that explained human nature as well as other things could. Jung had a much more kind of spiritual take on who we are as compared to Freud's sexual. Well, Freud was not the kind of guy who liked you to disagree with him. He was a great guy as long as you saw the world his way. But if you didn't see the world his way, he kind of just cut people off pretty quickly. And he did that with Jung. And Jung himself actually had what any book about him will talk about, this 6-year period in his life, and many people will attribute at least a part of that to this break he had with Freud. But he kind of had this 6-year period where he was very pensive and very thoughtful and didn't really do very much career-oriented. And some people speculate, was it a nervous breakdown? Was it a break with reality? Was he psychotic at the time? And nobody really knows. But he came through it, and he came out of it, and then he became a very prolific speaker and writer and studier and so forth and so on. So that's kind of the history of Jungian therapy. Because he, similar to Freud, was analytic, and because this was back, early on, right there where psychoanalysis and the birth of psychotherapy really is credited to his beginning, his ideas and Freud's ideas in many respects are very similar. So they both clearly have an idea that the unconscious has powerful forces. They both see early childhood experiences as being very important and very formative in terms of who we develop to be. Both of them in their therapy will have people do free association and will look at transference. Jung has a slightly different take on transference from what Freud has, but they both really believe in the transference relationship and in analyzing and working through the transference relationship. They both see dreams as being a beautiful road to the unconscious, and so having clients come in and talk about their dreams and understanding the dreams. Now, Jung, when he talked about dreams, took more of a kind of symbolic interpretation of dreams. In a different way than with Freud, dream analysis has never been something that I have been good at understanding or studying. And if I read a Jungian interpretation and a Freudian interpretation and somebody else's interpretation of dreams, I just get kind of mind-boggled. And I don't think I could tell you one person's from another's just to read it. But both of them really saw dreams as being very important and being ways, kind of pathways in to one's unconscious. So there were a lot of similarities, even though sadly for both of them, their paths broke, and I think they never came back together or spoke with each other after that break in the first decade of the 1900s. Some of the ideas that Jung kind of brought forth and that people still think are interesting and ponder today, and when I moved to Tri-Cities in the early 1990s and just looked at psychologists in the telephone book, there were 2 Jungian analysts in town there. So this is still a very alive, and there were 14 doctoral level psychologists at that time, and 2 of them were Jungian. So that's 1 out of 7. That's not a bad number. Jung not only talked about personal unconscious, which Freud talks about. The personal unconscious is sort of your own experiences, which may be stuffed down and so forth, and may cause what Jung called complexes, which are kind of places that you get stuck. Freud may have said we get fixated. Jung talks about that we develop complexes, which are kind of these neurotic things which make us sort of quirky individuals. So the personal unconscious is not terribly different from Freud's. But Jung has this notion of a collective unconscious, and this is very unique to him. What Jung believes is that because we are human, and because by being human we have similar characteristics, similar bodies, similar brains, similar capabilities, similar intellectual functioning with every other human on the planet, that there is at some level, there is not only my personal unconscious, but there's this unconscious that transcends all of us here on planet Earth. The best way I have of understanding it was when I read Jean Ull's Clan of the Cave Bear. And so if any of you have read that, when I was reading that, I thought, that's Carl Jung's collective unconscious. But it's kind of like this thing that these very, very, very prehistoric people were tapping into with the help of good mushrooms or something like that. But this, in the deep recesses of their brain, this thing which brought us all together across the globe. So Jung's idea is that we're all connected. Now again, this is mystical, this is cosmic, this is on the edge. but that somehow we are all connected at some unconscious level to every other human here. I guess if you want to think about Star Wars, in the original first Star Wars movie, which has now turned into movie number 4, but when they blow up the planet of Alderaan, and Obi-Wan Kenobi sort of goes like this, and he says, "I felt a great disturbance in the Force, as if millions of tiny voices suddenly cried out and were silenced." Well, that would be like, how would he know that? You know, he's in a ship flying towards this big satellite. How would he know that? Well, there was a disturbance in the Force. The Force, for Jung, would be the collective unconscious, that which binds us all together, some energy, some cosmic something that we can't see, we can't touch, and yet we all experience. Whether we inherit a piece in our brain that connects us to one another, who knows? But it's a very sort of tantalizing idea. As evidence of this collective unconscious, one of the things that Jung spends a lot of time talking about is this idea of archetypes. So what is an archetype? An archetype is not a thing. An archetype is sort of this idea or this structure, this piece of our brain that holds these ideas, these models, these things, which he found transcend time and transcend space. So the best way to talk about it is examples. He talks about that we have archetypes for things like death. We have archetypes for things like birth. We have archetypes for things like the wise old man. Well, what does this mean? This means if you were to do an anthropological analysis where you went around the globe interviewing people, that you would find that every culture, or practically every culture, has some sort of grieving about impending death or when someone has died. They have some sort of ritual around death. Many cultures have marriage and some sort of celebration of marriage. When a baby's born, many cultures have some, now they may be different in terms of exactly what they do, but they all have some sort of, celebration around that, which is different from a marriage celebration. If you look at the wise old man, there's some image which transcends time and space that most cultures will have. These Jung called archetypes, and he saw the fact that these things went all around the globe as being, well, maybe that really means there is a collective unconscious. There's something about us which all taps into the same energy source. Some of the specific archetypes that Jung elucidated and talked about and has become known for, one is the persona. The persona for Jung is similar to things which other models will talk about. The object relations folks will talk about the false self. This could be the outer layer of the onion that the Gestalt folks talk about. But the persona is the mask. It is the face that we put forth to the external world. Sometimes one's persona and one's self are fairly similar. So myself is who I truly am deep down in my core. My persona is who I share with the world. I may share a different persona with different people based on who they are. I may have one work persona, I may have another home persona, I may have another at the ball game persona. Myself is constant, it is steady, it is the true me. Some people have very little difference. They are who they are, you see what you get, and they're cool. Like it or leave it. Other people really do they feel sort of like they're putting on their masks as they go to work, or they're putting on their mask as they go, visit their in-laws, because my in-laws really don't like me, so I feel like I have to put on this facade. The closer the connection here, sort of a theory would be that the healthier and more integrated the person, the further apart, the more discomfort this persona is going to cause the self. We all have in us an anima and an animus. These are the male and female parts of us, and Jung believes that everybody has sort of stereotypical female parts. These are the nurturing characteristics, and everybody has male parts. These are kind of the I'm going to do it characteristics. We each have both components, and people who we see and we look at and say, that is an incredibly feminine woman, would have a very strong anima and perhaps hide most of her animus. the real macho dude, you know, Clint Eastwood, Arnold Schwarzenegger folks, their anima is very much part of their persona, and their anima may be very hidden. It doesn't mean they don't have it, it just means that's not sort of what they bring forth. The shadow is the part of oneself that we keep hidden. So for some people, the other gender may be kind of what stays hidden in us. The shadow is the parts of ourselves that we're not so in touch with and that we may keep back there. Often we think of this as our darker side. Many of the things which are kept in the shadow may be sort of our darker, scary things. So our aggressive impulses, or the voice in our head, which is very nasty and judgmental, which we prefer didn't exist. At the same time, sometimes the shadow is just part of ourselves that we're not very in touch with, and yet can be a great creative driving force. So Jung sees that these are all kind of archetypes, and they're all part of our makeup. And as one would be working in a Jungian therapy, you kind of think of a person in light of these constructs and might share some of that with someone and help them to work on helping that make them more whole. Another big part of a Jungian model is this idea of opposites. Jung believed that sort of one of his driving principles is a sense of wholeness, and he sees us as kind of having this dynamic, it is a psychodynamic theory, we're in this dynamic flux from one end of a spectrum to another, one end of a spectrum to another, one end of a spectrum to another. So life is this kind of continual balance of opposites. Any of you familiar with the Myers-Briggs type inventory? That is a psychological test. It's not a test of health or non-health. It's a test of how you interface the world, particularly your social reality. And the Myers-Briggs is based on Jungian sort of dichotomies. The introvert and the extrovert. Introverts, as we all sort of come to appreciate, are people who sort of recharge by being by themselves. They like quiet time, they like looking inward. Extroverts are people who recharge by going out and talking with people and being being social. Thinking and feeling. Thinkers are people who tend to make decisions by sort of looking analytically at things. Feelers are people who sort of jump in, and if you like it, cool. If you don't like it, such is life. But they act more on emotion. These people act more on the sort of, these are your limbic system folks, and these are your cerebral cortex folks. Sensing and intuiting. Sensing are people who like to gather lots of data. Intuiting people are people who go more on global impressions and hunches. This and this are somewhat related to each other, but also somewhat different. Judging and perceiving, this is how we make decisions. People who judge tend to kind of gather the information and make a clear decision. People who perceive like to talk about things. Well, let's look at this side of it. Well, let's talk about that. I don't think we fully explored our options. Not really sure we should really make a decision yet. We don't know. Some of the data is still out. None of these, while judges are like, made a decision long ago, let's move on. None of these are better or worse. They're all just different. The Myers-Briggs can be a great tool to help people understand how you are and to help you understand how people who are close to you are. Because if you get married, it's very easy to blame the other person for being a bad person because they're different from you. The introvert who wants to stay home on the weekends is no fun. The extrovert who always wants to go out flits around and never has any seriousness. The judger makes snap decisions. Can't you ever consider all the possibilities? The perceiver can never come to closure, can never decide on anything. They're always just spinning ideas around in their head. So if you look at each of these, and this is, the INFPs or the ENTJs or whatever, you put these together in terms of where you score on each of these continuums, and then the first letters are what you use for the types on the Myers-Briggs. But this can help in work environments, it can help in couples, it can help in families. It can really help appreciate sort of why it is that people act the way they do and gain an understanding that it's not better, it's not worse, there's not right and there's not wrong, there's just different. Anyway, these are some of the main theories. If you look at the specific sort of nuts and bolts of this therapy, in a Jungian analysis there are 4 kinds of steps that people will go through. First of all, they come in and there's a catharsis. Catharsis is, you know, I need to come in and I need to tell you what's going on in my life. So it's kind of the dump. This takes a while. Jungian analysis is not a quick model. So you can start for the first few sessions or longer. Elucidation is the opportunity to kind of learn about what's going on, so that this is the stage where you start seeing things, making connections, gaining some insight, gaining some awareness. Social sense is this idea which is similar when we talk about Alfred Adler, similar to Adler's sense that we are all a part of the greater world, not the collective unconscious, just the greater world. We're connected to other humans. And what I do is impacted by people around me, and what I do affects people around me. And gaining an appreciation of that, so it's not just kind of the all me thing. Transformation is the last stage of the therapy process. This is when you're working through the transference, and it takes both the therapist as well as the client to do this. And in the transformation is when the client will really make the big change. Many clients never make it to the transformation stage. They've gotten enough in the earlier stages that they leave therapy. So Jung wrote about that it was only 1 in every X amount of clients who actually made it to the transformation stage. But this is where like huge growth can occur. The other thing that he wrote about was that in order for your client to be able to reach the transformation stage, you, the practitioner, must be willing to change too. So that if you're kind of, I am who I am and change is scary and I like my life just as it is, you're not going to be able to take your client on the journey that he or she needs to go on in order to transform, because you're going to be consciously or unconsciously holding them back because their change is somehow threatening or scary to you or your relationship. So in order for your client to be able to achieve this, you yourself will change with them. And this is one of the reasons why when people were trained in analysis back, gosh, up through, probably up through where people are trained in psychoanalysis in schools today, although that's rare. Very often a prerequisite for doing analysis was to go through your own analysis. And the reason for that is that if your client's ready to become transformed and you can't walk that path with them, then you're keeping your client back, and they can't really transfer to another therapist without losing so much ground. So it's really very helpful if you yourself are free enough and self-knowledgeable enough that you can go through this whole thing with your client. Anyway, that is pretty much all I have to say about Carl Jung.